Okie doke, when you're ready.
How do you support your students on the autism spectrum to overcome their barriers to the learning process? I'm Dr. Matt Kapp, and in this video we're going to explore how we can apply the Universal Design for Learning framework to your lesson planning. The Universal Design for Learning framework is a proactive approach to supporting students to overcome their barriers to the learning process during the initial planning, teaching and assessment cycle. Rather than doing multiple different things for multiple different students, teachers are encouraged to identify their students' barriers to the learning process and identify strategies that will help the students overcome these and then embed them into their initial planning. Universal Design for Learning, developed by Harvard University, aims to develop expert learners who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal-directed. To achieve this, the Universal Design for Learning framework is underpinned by three broad principles. These principles all have specific strategies to achieve them. Principle 1 in the Universal Design for Learning framework is the idea that teachers engage students in the learning process in multiple ways. We all know that not every student is engaged by the same thing. For students on the autism spectrum, research has shown that when teachers access their restricted interests, students are more likely to be more engaged and achieve better educational outcomes. Principle 2 is based on the idea that teachers represent knowledge in multiple ways to their students. This helps teachers answer the following questions. Do all the students in my class understand what I am teaching them? The third principle is based on the idea that students are able to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding in multiple ways. In the Universal Design for Learning framework, the learning goal is not tied to a specific way of demonstrating it unless the Australian curriculum explicitly states it. Before we look at how to embed the Universal Design for Learning framework in your lesson planning, it's important to identify and revise the 4 stages of the lesson plan. Based on the work of Vygotsky, there are 4 stages to a lesson plan. Vygotsky argued that students achieve more collaboratively than they do independently. The first stage of the lesson plan is when teachers contextualize the knowledge in the content descriptors of the Australian curriculum. In the second stage, teachers model independently and with the students the skills outlined in the content descriptors of the Australian curriculum. The third and fourth stages are when students in groups and then independently demonstrate the achievement standards in the Australian curriculum. To embed the Universal Design for Learning framework in lesson plans, there are 7 steps. In the first step, teachers collaboratively discuss the content descriptors in the Australian curriculum. They identify collaboratively the knowledge that needs to be taught and the skills that students need to be demonstrated to. This is because when teachers work collaboratively, they're generally more accurate in their interpretation of curriculum than when they do it independently. The first barrier to the learning process is when teachers unintentionally add additional content or skills to the Australian curriculum that is not developmentally appropriate. Then they apply the knowledge they've identified from the content descriptors to the first stage of the lesson plan during that contextualization stage. The skills they've identified in the content descriptors are modeled independently and with their students during the second stage of the lesson plan. Teachers then collaboratively discuss the achievement standards in the Australian curriculum. They collaboratively identify what the cognitive verbs are asking students to do. They also collaboratively discuss what the achievement standard is asking the students to demonstrate and not demonstrate. Another barrier to the learning process is when teachers unintentionally add additional skills to be demonstrated to the Australian curriculum that are not developmentally appropriate. Remembering, in Universal Design for Learning, the learning goal is not tied to a specific way of demonstrating it unless explicitly stated. For this reason, it's important for teachers to collaboratively identify what the achievement standard is asking the students to do, because that's what the learning goal requires the students to demonstrate. In step 3, teachers identify the strengths, challenges, and functional impact of their student on the autism spectrum. To achieve this, they can use the positive partnerships matrix. Once teachers have identified their strengths, challenges, and functional impact of their students, they can go to step 4, where they look through the strategies associated with the Universal Design for Learning framework. They're identifying and looking for strategies that clearly connect to their students' strengths, challenges, and functional impact. At step 5, teachers then connect those strategies to their students' strengths, challenges, and functional impact. At step 6, they take those strategies they've identified from the Universal Design for Learning framework and applied it to their lesson planning. The strategies from Principle 1, the idea that teachers engage students in the learning process in multiple ways, can be applied to all 4 stages of the lesson plan. The strategies from Principle 2, where teachers represent knowledge to students in multiple ways, are applied to the first two stages of the lesson plan, where teachers contextualize the knowledge and model the skills from the content descriptors. The principles from stage 3, where teachers allow students to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding in multiple ways, are applied to the third and fourth stages of the lesson plan. In the final step, or step 7 of the lesson planning process, teachers problem solve around what those strategies will look like in the classroom. Universal design for learning is not over explicit in how it's achieved in a classroom. They're really broad strategies to think about during the lesson planning process. By applying the Universal Design for Learning framework to your lesson planning, you can help your students on the autism spectrum overcome their barriers to the learning process.